Hello everyone and welcome back to the Chess24 Legends of Chess tournament. We are in round 7 and it's game 4 of the match, Magnus Carlsen versus Peter Svidler. It was 3 games filled with some real excitement. Magnus had his chances in game 2 and basically it was a pretty equalish match, but Magnus really had some great winning chances in game 2. Not just winning chances, the position was winning. But it's a rapid game, no one can see everything. And this is now game 4, the previous 3 games have been drawn, and whoever wins the match. Or rather, if it's a draw, they go into Armageddon. So Magnus, with the white pieces, opens with d4. We have knight to f6 by Svidler, knight f3, and g6. We have bishop to f4, Magnus goes for his famous London system. We have bishop to g7 by Svidler, and e3. And Svidler just castles, very a natural development. With bishop to e2 by Magnus and c5 now striking in the center, castles by Magnus, and queen to b6 now putting pressure on the b2 pawn, as one usually does when playing against this system. And the most common move here is knight b to d2, but Magnus goes for queen to c1. First knight b to d2, trying to give up the b2 pawn, and although it may be possible to capture it, no one ever captured this pawn, like ever. In top tier tournaments, because knight c4 then attacks the queen, and it's white will get just a lot of development for the sacrificed pawn. And if you're not sure about this, which I'm pretty sure no one is, as no one ever captured this, you just don't do. So instead, Svidler goes for d5. It is the most common move here, and only now queen to c1. Magnus defends now the b2 pawn. And here there is one game in the database where c captures on d4 was played, but Svidler continues with knight to c6, and it is as of move 8 that we have a completely new game. So here Magnus continues with c3, just strengthens his center, and Svidler goes after the strong dark square bishop. So knight to h5 attacks the bishop, also opens up this bishop's diagonal. Bishop to g5 by Magnus, Magnus trying to create some weaknesses on the king side by getting Peter to advance his pawns, which is exactly what he does. So h6, bishop h4, and now g5. And here was the first actual thing of the game that Magnus took a little bit longer. He was deciding probably between ideas like just knight captures here, as it opens up the attack towards this knight, although it is very unclear. For example, something like this, you grab 2 pawns for a piece, you have an attack on the knight, and well, could be maybe playable, but the engine doesn't like it, and neither does Magnus. Another thing you could do is, before just retreating, is something like captures here, attacks the queen, and after queen captures, now knight e1, now offer a trade of pieces here, bishop for a knight. But black would be very happy here. First a remaneuver with an attack on the queen, queen b6, and now you grab it back. But black is the one who has the bishop pair. Black has a very nice queen, a very nice central control. e5 is coming, and once you move the king, let's say to h8, it will be very safe there. White doesn't have a dark square bishop, and also you can just shift the rook over to the g file. So it would be black who would enjoy this position. So instead, after g5, Magnus just goes back, although he probably did check all of these lines, and now Svidler just trades it. We have knight captures and h captures, and with this, Svidler wins the bishop pair. And strikes in the center with e5. And if you saw this position like in a book written, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, the author would be like, black just equalized with his e5 move, or maybe black can never be worse, or something like that. But it is definitely the principled way to go, just striking in the center. So knight captures on e5, knight captures and d captures on e5. We have bishop captures on e5, and now a very interesting maneuver by Magnus. He goes for e4. And e4 is very interesting because after d captures on e4, what was played, Magnus doesn't recapture it by knight captures, but rather goes knight to c4 with an attack on the bishop and the queen. Queen moves to defend the bishop, so queen e6, and now comes queen e3, attacking this pawn and this pawn. And this is how Magnus wins his pawn back, by gaining more activity. So bishop back to g7. Of course, Svidler doesn't want to give up his strong dark square bishop, especially now that he created some weaknesses here around his king. And now queen captures on c5. Magnus wins back his pawn, but just b6, preparing to develop this light square bishop, let's say to this diagonal, bring the rook into the game, and so on. So queen to a3 by Magnus, and it is a it is kind of a weird square for the queen. It's hard to say where the queen will go from there, and this is probably what convinced Peter that he should now strike in the king side. And he does with this f5 move. And now, well, he's of course preparing f4, maybe f3, e3, and so on. And Carlsen's queen is, for the moment, pretty much out of the game. And you don't have any like 93 ideas with this. It seems like there could be something, but you either just move the king or bring the queen here, prepare bishop e6, and so on. So here, after f5, Magnus goes rook 8 to d1. He does have excellent control of the e6 square, so even if he wanted, he can just play queen here, but even better would be maybe just bring the rook over here. So here, Svidler goes bishop to d7, and now comes rook to d6, so gaining a lot of activity for this rook. There's no way to stop this, so Svidler doesn't even try to prevent this rook from reaching this. We have queen back to e8, and now a lot of moves are possible here. For example, knight to e3, preparing to shift the bishop over to this diagonal might be a very nice idea. But Magnus goes for the very straightforward bishop to h5. Now just attacks the queen here, and he wants to trade this bishop for this bishop. But you don't just trade bishops, you also allow this rook this beautiful active square. So instead, Svidler just goes back, queen e7, and now Magnus again took some time to think here. He played knight to e3 now. There was the extremely interesting knight to e5 with a double attack on the bishop here, hoping for bishop captures on e5, and then you get this discovery here, just a rook g6 check, and the queen falls. Or you defend the queen with the king, but now just pretty much anything wins as the king is now in front of the bishop, so you can fool around here. Let's say king g7, you go back, check, you go back here. Now you can pick up the b6 pawn, at least grab some pawns before you grab the queen, king g8. And now you grab the queen, but after, let's say this, you capture here, and of course white is completely winning here. So after this queen to e7 move, although very interesting, knight e5, Magnus decides for knight to e3 rather, and now comes bishop back to e6. Now he wants to play bishop to f7 and, well, trade off this light square bishop. So Magnus goes back, bishop to d1. Now with the very interesting threat of rook captures on e6. If queen captures, then just bishop b3 just wins the queen, as the queen would be on the same diagonal as the king. And the situation on the clock is 10 minutes Magnus with 6 minutes for Peter. So Peter continues pushing on the king side with f4. He's not worried about this, as he will also win a piece here. So it's not a problem. And Magnus, after taking some time to consider the resulting endgame, decides to enter the endgame. So rook captures on e6. Now, of course, you cannot capture because of the idea that we've just mentioned. And queen captures on a3. We have b captures on a3, and now f captures on e3. Svidler wins back his piece. F captures on e3, and now rook captures on f1. So everything gets traded off. King captures and king to f8. And now we have this resulting endgame where Magnus is up a pawn, but he has a double G pawn and a double A pawn, and it's bishops of opposite colors. So all in all, looks like a very drawish position. But of course, it's Carlsen's last game with white. Of course, he will try everything before going to Armageddon. So he starts bringing the king into the game. King e2. And rook to c8 by Svidler, going after the c3 pawn. We have bishop to b3 now. Offering the c3 pawn. There's no real good way to defend it, as it was attacked twice. So rook captures, and now rook captures on e4. We have rook to c5 by Svidler, and now Svidler is saying, okay, I control the c5 square with my pawn, I control the e5 square with my bishop. I'm just gonna shift this rook from here to here, and that's my plan for this game. Easy draw, and we go into Armageddon. And in fact, this seems to be true. So Magnus goes to rook to e6, and now rook to e5. Svidler offers a trade of rooks, as of course the opposite color bishop endgame is a draw. So rook back to d6 by Magnus, and now king to e7, attacking the rook. Magnus tries to attack the bishop, Svidler goes back, and now g4. And okay, rook back to c5, Svidler sticking to his plan. And we have a4 by Magnus. We have rook to e5, and now king to d3. We have rook back to c5 by Svidler, just repeating e5, c5, and bishop to c4 now. So rook to e5, and now comes rook to c6. Here Magnus tries to take away the c5 square from the rook, but Svidler just goes back. So again, offering a trade of rooks. We have rook to d6 by Magnus, and now king to e7. Attacking the rook, we have rook to g6 now, and king back to f8. So it seems that there is no way to make a breakthrough here, but there are some more pawn pushes to be made. So Magnus goes for e4, and now we have rook to c7. By Svidler, now not repeating rook to e5, probably to avoid something like bishop to d5, which would then take away the c5 square from the rook. So instead, he goes rook to c7, so he doesn't get locked out with the bishop. And now comes a5 by Magnus. Now with the rook away from the 5th rank, Magnus creates some weaknesses here. So Svidler captures, we have captures here, and now rook to a6, going after the a5 pawn. We have king e7, and now here comes a very, very interesting move. It's the only way to look for any advantage in this position as white, and even feel free to pause the video here to try to find this move while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on spotting that the pawn can now finally cross the e5 square. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's e5. And the reason why e5 is so strong, because if it's captured, rook e6 check wins the bishop. So Magnus was able to create some poison in the position, so Svidler went back, king to f8. And now comes rook captures on a5, grabbing that pawn. And okay, now Magnus has a nice passed pawn defended by the rook. The pawn is coming to e6, which is defended by the bishop, and things are definitely improving as white is making some progress. So king back to e7 by Svidler, and now bishop back to b3. So the king can now come into the game as the bishop was vulnerable on c4. So rook b7, and now king to e4, grabbing more space. We have bishop to f8. It's very hard to move for Svidler's king, as the bishop and pawn are really controlling the squares here. So he goes bishop to f8, but now king f5. We have rook to c7, and now comes rook to a6, grabbing more squares. We have king to e8, and now king to g6 by Magnus. We have rook to b7, now just waiting to see what Magnus will do, and now rook to e6 with check. We have king to d8, and now rook to f6. Now the bishop is under attack, so bishop to e7, and now a very sneaky move by Magnus. Now he says, okay, you can have the rook, just king captures on h6. And now the point is, if Svidler grabs the rook, then yes, pawn captures, and let's say whatever, as you kind of do need to bring the king over here, then you can just pick up this pawn. You're up 3 pawns, and when this pawn starts marching forward along with the f-pawn, it's game over. So Svidler has to go do something else. We have rook to b5 now, or going after the pawn, but now comes rook to f5, now just defending the pawn. We have rook to b4 going after the g4 pawn, and now e6 by Magnus, now allowing this capture so he can start making more progress. So Svidler captures it, there is no better move to be made, and now rook to d5 with check, king to e8, and now king to g6. Now a lot of squares taken away from the black king, the pawn really constricting the movement of the king. So rook to f4, but now comes rook to a5, now going after this pawn here. There's no way to prevent this. King to f8 was played, and now rook captures on a7. And here rook to f6 with check. We have king to h7, and now you have to be careful, otherwise rook to a8 just wins the game. The black king has no squares. You're going to have to give up the bishop, and it's just going to be a very quick death from then on. So bishop back to d6, but now comes rook to f7, probably the quickest way to end. Rook to f7 check forces a rook trade. We have rook captures, pawn captures, and it was in this position that Peter Svidler resigned the game on move 64, as all men should, as there is nothing more to be done here. White is up 2 pawns, and there's just no playing this. It's the simplest principle of 2 weaknesses. You have this guy here, that's a weakness, and even though maybe you can defend this guy, then this pawn creates a second weakness, and you will not be able to take care of everything. At some point the bishop will have to move. You're either going to win this pawn and then push this pawn. It's just not possible to hold this, which of course they both know, and here Svidler resigns. So really a wild match. Really thought it could go either way, especially this game 4. I really thought that now, okay, Magnus had his great chance in game 2, and Svidler defended well. He defended well in game 1, and now in game 4 he started that attack with a nice going f4, you know, just going after Carlsen's king. Carlsen had a somewhat of an inactive queen on a3, but it's only you know, visibly inactive, like the queen was doing so much from a3 actually. But yeah, I thought it would go Peter's way, but it didn't. Magnus wins another game without reaching Armageddon. So for now, only Vasily Ivanchuk got Magnus to Armageddon. Other than that, Magnus gets the full 3 points on all other matches. So he is the leader still, but we are going to discuss the standings as we are going to show some more games from this round. There were quite a lot of good ones. So yeah, once again, I do hope you enjoyed it. I would like to thank Rian Jans van Rensburg, Darshil Kumar Koshti, Kai Einar Turfors, David Weinraub, and Mark Poitras for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Chess24 Legends of Chess tournament, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. So thank you all, I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.